No group in America has been helped more by government than American Indians. And yet, some politicians still tell Indians things like this.
Few have been ignored by Washington for as long as Native Americans.
Ignored? Are you kidding me? Look at the signs around this Sioux reservation in South Dakota. Our government has made Indian tribes wards of our state. Government manages their land, provides their health care, their schools, gives them food stamps, pays for housing, child care, even burial assistance. The result?
There is a stunning poverty here. Only 1 in 4 has a job. There is a scarcity of phones, not even any banks.
Indians have the highest poverty rate and lowest life expectancy of any group in America. So the Sioux told us they need more handouts.
The government should be giving the Indian people more appropriations so that we could exist out here still.
I really feel Obama's administration needs to get up to the plate and deal with it.
Because white people stole the Indians' land hundreds of years ago, the government signed treaties. And that's why Washington sends billions of dollars to Indian tribes every year.
Everybody thinks the government owes them something.
It's odd in that no group has been more helped by government than the American Indians, and no group does worse.
Maybe it's the government.
Ben Chavis is a member of a tribe that doesn't get special government help. And yet,
the area where you live looks different from Indian reservations.
There's mansions. They look like English manors. I can take you to one neighborhood where my people are from and show you nicer homes than the whole Sioux reservation.
And this is not casino money, no special deal for your tribe.
Oh, no. In my tribe, we don't have any casinos. We have 12 banks.
Chavis says his tribe does well because the federal government does not recognize them as a sovereign tribe, though their congressman wants to change that.
It's time for discrimination to end and recognition to begin.
Old Mike knows if he wants to stay in Washington, D.C., he has to support the Lumbees or he won't be there.
This is an injustice that, yes, must finally be resolved.
If the congressman gets his way, your tribe would just get $80 million. It's tough to say no to that.
If you want to become dependent on the government and sell your soul for $80 million, I understand that. And some people are willing to do that.
Indian activists like lawyer Elizabeth Homer say the Lumbees ought to get federal recognition. Homer used to be the U.S. Interior Department's Director of American Indian Trusts.
Lumbees have been neglected and left out of the system and have been petitioning for 100 years for their recognition, for which they're entitled, by the way.
They're petitioning because socialists like you have convinced them to do that.
But now.
They do better without the government.
If I'm a socialist, what does that make you?
Bye. It makes me and Ben Chavis capitalists. And capitalist Indians achieve.
Your Indians are thriving.
Our Indians are working.
The Scott brothers built a company that now employs 16 people, putting up power lines. They didn't get any government help.
It made me drive twice as hard, knowing it wouldn't help us and all. It panned out pretty good for us.
We've just always been hard workers. So that's what that is.
This Lumbee tribe member, Lindsay Locklear, runs one of the biggest True Value hardware stores in the country.
The day after I graduated, the next day I was at work.
The Lumbees are doing well.
Tremendous survivors. A great example of how you can continue to persist under absolutely the worst treatment that you could hope to get.
They do well because they've divorced themselves from these government handouts. They've done well.
Individuals have done well.
Exactly.
Individuals free of special government protection, like Lumbee Jim Thomas, a real estate developer who used to own the Sacramento Kings. Jack Lowry, an original owner of the Cracker Barrel restaurants. Or Sybil Bullard, who owns J.R. Jones Grain.
We had to fend for ourselves. We had to do what we needed to do to survive. We don't mind getting our hands dirty and getting the job done, because we know that if we do, we will be rewarded for that.
What helped the Lumbees, said Ben, was knowing that they had to become entrepreneurs and support themselves.
On the reservations, they haven't trained to be capitalists. They've been trained to be communists. Everything you need someone's approval.
Tribal governments and the Bureau of Indian Affairs manage most Indian land in America. Indians often compete to serve on tribal councils because then they can give out the government's money.
You can help your relatives. You can help your girlfriend. You can help your girlfriend's mama. It's a great program.
Not so great for the majority of Indians. Because the government owns most Indian property, individuals rarely build nice homes or businesses.
No individual on the reservation owns the land, so they can't do anything with it. They can't develop it. Let's look at my tribe. We have title and deeds to our land. That's the secret. I raise cattle, Red Angus cattle. I can do what I want to because it's my private property. My buddy on the White Mountain Apache Reservation, he has a farm, but he can't do the same things I can do. If the tribe decided one day, we want to take your land on the reservation and give it to one of my relatives, they could do that.
Government handouts don't work well even for the freeloaders. But there are always enablers who say, yes, they will.
American Indians own more land than any group in America, and you are still the poorest group. How can that be?
Indian reservations are basically in areas that have been neglected by the United States. The tribes have been located in some of the most isolated areas geographically.
So what? Other isolated groups have done well.
How come the Mormons got rich? Where they lived, it's just as poor. How come the Amish got wealthy, even rejecting modern tools?
I don't know how wealthy the Amish are, and I don't know how the Mormons got rich.
Maybe because they weren't relying on government rules and Indian trusts and all your lawyering that teaches Indians to be helpless?
Oh my goodness, I don't think that that's true at all. I take umbrage at that, sir.
What you're really saying is Indians are too dumb to manage their own land, so the government has to be, papa and take care of us. We don't need the government giving us handouts.
There is no Bureau of Irish Affairs or Latino Affairs. Why is there a Bureau of Indian Affairs?
We are a starved people in a rich nation.
Already we've got the Empowering Tribal Nations Initiative, the Advancing Nation-to-Nation Relationships, Protecting Indian Country, Tribal Priority Allocations, Indian Land Consolidation Program. All these government programs. Indians are poor.
Indians are poor.
Die young.
And that's why these programs are so important.
But maybe these programs are why Indians are poor.
Well, I don't think that that's a fair thing to say. In fact, I think that they are the most neglected of any population in the United States.
Government needs to do more.
Yeah.
And every freeloader wants more.
We get welfare checks, we get grant checks, we get food stamps, but if you look at these farmers and ranchers, they get the same thing. That's what these subsidy payments are for.
It is true that subsidies also go to farmers and ranchers and big companies. But just like the gifts given these people, subsidies keep you dependent. The handouts certainly haven't helped America's Indians.
We got all kind of Indian programs in America. The homeless program, the stimulus packet. It's all welfare. It's all a con.
Have you ever been to an Indian reservation? If you have, you probably saw serious poverty and alcoholism and drug abuse. Is it because there's something about Indians that makes them lazy or irresponsible? No. When Indians own their own land, they do about as well as other Americans. Manny Jules wants to see more of that. He was chief of the Kamloops Indian Band in Canada for 16 years. Manny, why are so many Indians so poor?
Well, first of all, John, nobody chooses poverty. One of the things that's happened is we've been legislated out of the economy by the federal governments, both in the United States and Canada.
What do you mean they've been taking care of you? That sounds like the best deal.
By taking care of us, that means providing social welfare programs. The only way to break the cycle of poverty, I believe, is by the recognition that every other Canadian and American takes for granted, and that's real property rights.
So in Canada, as in much of the U.S., reserves are owned by the government.
Yes.
So the Indian has some piece of paper that says, this is my lot.
But underlying that title is the fact that in Canada, the federal government owns the land.
So you can't borrow against it.
You can't borrow, you can't get a mortgage, you can't be bonded. There's nothing that you can have that'll allow you to be able to go to the bank on your own without the minister co-signing that loan.
Let's bring another guest from PERC, economist Terry Anderson, into this. Terry, you find Indians do much better when they own their own land.
Yes, John. I first got interested in this subject in 1976 when I visited a member of the Flathead Indian Reservation. And while visiting his house, I noted just how well off he was. He was not in poverty, and I asked, how do you explain this? And I'll never forget him leaning across the table, resting his chin on his hand and elbow, saying, I own this place. And that was my first introduction to the fact that many reservations in the United States do have some fee simple land, that is privately owned land like you and I own our houses. And the Indians that have privately owned land do much, much better. Their land is way more productive than the land that is overseen by the federal government, held in
40
trust.
to 90% more productive, you've found.
Yes, the statistics are just astounding. I've done a lot of gathering of those data, and they show that that fee simple lands are anywhere from 40 to 90% more productive than the lands held in trust. And as Manny said, these Indians who have their land under the trusteeship of the federal government can't borrow against them. They are really locked into a poverty cycle as a result.
It is pretty amazing that no group has been more taken care of by big government than the Indians, and no group in America has done worse.
Fundamentally, the root of the problem is the fact that we don't have the same property rights as others take for granted. And that has to fundamentally change. We have to be able to recognize the collective ownership by the tribe or the band and free the imagination of the individual entrepreneur. We've had economies that went back many, many millennia and were successful until 1492.
And Terry, you found that Indians had a form of property rights before white settlers came here and messed that up.
Before contact with whites, Indians were very much aware of markets and trading and property rights. Some Indians actually owned the salmon streams. They managed those streams so that they let the larger salmon go up to spawn. And the result is that even today, those streams have larger salmon than the streams that were held in commons, owned by everyone and hence managed by no one.
The clan, not an individual Indian, but a clan would own the stream. And why today would they still have more salmon?
That just goes back to what was superior management over a century ago. And at the same time, I should note, we are mismanaging our salmon stocks by chasing them around the ocean, open ocean, and over-harvesting salmon and many other fish species. We could learn from what the Native Americans did to husband their resources.
And you say you can see the private property difference just by driving through some Indian land.
Oh, it's fascinating to drive through a reservation in the West. Recently, I drove through the Crow Indian Reservation in south central Montana, and when you would come to a fence line and on one side see overgrazing, a few scrawny cattle, maybe a house, and if so, not a very livable house. Right next door, you would see cultivated fields, irrigation systems, beautiful barn, home, and so on. And you don't even need to look at the property records to know that the productive one is held in private and the other one is held in common, in trust by the federal government.
Indians on both sides of the road, but private property on one. And you can even see it from the Google Maps, the difference.
You can see it from the Google Maps. It's fascinating to just Google a reservation, the Blackfeet Reservation, the Crow Reservation.
Here's Blackfeet. There's not much development, very few farms. Here's one where they have private property rights.
You can see the same thing on Manny's reserves, where they have managed to develop an industrial park. They're creating jobs, creating wealth, and at least getting 1 foot up the ladder out of poverty.
Manny, I'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, well, what we have to do is reverse 500 years of colonization, put First Nations, Indian tribes in the driver's seat. We can be successful where the federal and governments in both countries have failed. And the only way that that ultimately can be resolved is by granting us the right to be able to own our own lands.